unit 4B lesson is going to examine the various facets of the Cold War. We're going to talk about all the different conflicts, but the most significant thing about the Cold War is there wasn't out-and-out battlefield fighting. The Cold War was manifested, rather, in a variety of proxy wars across the globe. These were kind of satellite conflicts that reflected the tensions between the USSR and the U.S., but were not direct conflicts in most cases. We're going to examine some of those. First, the Korean War. Korea was a former Japanese colony. As the USSR rose in power, North Korea was led by communists and South Korea by anti-communists. In 1950, North Korea attacks the South, and America and other allied powers come to defense of the South, while Chinese and Soviet powers come to defense of the North. Over time, the Korean War became a stalemate, and 2 years later, it ends inconclusively. Though South Korea was not lost, it is divided along the same parallel that it was originally, but 53,000 Americans died, and 1 million Koreans and Chinese dead, but no one could could claim a victory. And so these conflicts, this illustrates how murky war had become and how undefined the Cold War was. Another area of competition between the Soviet Union and the United States is the CIA and the KGB. These were both spy agencies. They focused on spying on the other. These were covert agencies with plants in each country trying to gain an advantage and intelligence on their rival. The domino theory emerges as Eisenhower claims we have to be very careful not to let any more countries fall to communism. You can see from the photo here that his case was if Vietnam fell, then other countries would follow. So the domino theory illustrates that America is going to have to be involved across the globe in order to try to stop the expansion of the Soviet Union and communism. Another area in which the USSR and US were in competition was the space race. Both sides are trying to race to get to the moon. Russia has a lot of really early advantages and early victories, but America catches up. We launch satellites after the Soviets launched their initial one, but of course we know that America makes it to the moon first, and this is a huge victory for the United States in this way. One of the many things that comes out of the space race is paranoia. The dogmonauts, as they were lovingly called, the dogs the Soviet Union put into orbit first, these dogs came back to Earth, and they later had puppies, and so one of the puppies was given as a gift from Khrushchev to Jackie Kennedy, and before Jackie was allowed to have the dog, they had to check the dog to be sure that it wasn't fitted with some sort of spy device. If paranoia is the heart of the Cold War tactics, then the heart of the Cold War's geographics is Berlin. After the Second World War is over, Germany is divided among the four major powers, and Berlin is also divided among the four major powers. It doesn't take long for Western Berlin to unite as a non-communist government. Between 1949 and 1961, 2.7 East million Germans leave trying to escape communism. But the tensions between these two groups illustrate how different these two groups view the world. The U2 summit comes in September of 1959 and is a major embarrassment to Eisenhower. The Soviets downed a spy plane. When Khrushchev talks to Eisenhower about it, he says, "Oh, that's not a spy plane, it's a weather plane." Ike said this because he'd been told that the plane was destroyed and the pilot was dead. Well, then Khrushchev says, oh, is it really? Yes, we promise. And Khrushchev says, well, we have not only taken your plane, but we have the pilot as well. And obviously, upon investigation of the plane and interrogation of the pilot, the Soviet Union realizes that this is a spy plane and are able to use it to humiliate America on the world stage. In January of 1959, Cuba falls to communists. This is terrifying to many Americans, as there are now communists entrenched in a government that is only 90 miles off of the southern coast of Florida. At that time, they plan an operation known as Operation Trinidad. When JFK becomes president, he finds out about this. Basically, the idea was American CIA rebels would land in Cuba and attempt to overthrow Castro. The thinking was that Cuba didn't really want to be communist, and if we could get some boots on the ground, that they would rise up against him. What happens is they are horribly defeated. JFK doesn't send in reinforcements, and America is again humiliated on the world stage. As people continue to leave Berlin, East Germany and East Berlin, for West Berlin, Khrushchev decides that he is going to build a wall. Obviously, JFK, speaks out about this, but he really largely does nothing. It was right on the heels of the Bay of Pigs. We'd had this big American embarrassment, and JFK was very reluctant to become involved and make a big stand about the Berlin Wall. And so because he chose to do nothing, it really emboldened and empowered communist forces. Back to Cuba, after this, the Bay of Pigs, Castro invites Khrushchev to put nuclear weapons in Cuba, which basically takes many people in the world to the brink. Obviously, these countries that have been fighting and disagreeing for years are now within firing range of each other. Citizens of both countries spent many anxious hours in their bomb shelters, and onlookers the world over wrestled with their rising fears that a nuclear Armageddon was upon them. After a very difficult couple of weeks, the Soviets agreed to take their missiles out, and Kennedy calls this a victory. Now, what was not publicized at the time is the way Kennedy was able to get those nukes removed is he promised we would remove American nuclear weapons from Turkey. In Vietnam in 1953, there were Chinese-backed communist fighters that took over North Vietnam. And South Vietnam was supported and facilitated democracy via the United States and the United Nations. Though China and the USSR were obviously supplying the Viet Cong rebels, most people were reluctant to have America get involved. On August 7th, 1964, Johnson told American and North Vietnamese that there had been an attack in the Tonkin Gulf. And he, as a result, was going to take all necessary measures to repel any armed attack against the forces of the United States. The thing that is remarkable about this is actually it turns out to not be true, but also this is the beginning of what we're going to talk about in 4D, which is war becoming very murky and undefined in the modern era. Johnson uses an event he claimed happened to take it upon himself to usurp the power originally given to Congress in the U.S. Constitution. Over time, fighting in Vietnam will become brutal. There were two fronts. In North Vietnam, there's bombing efforts, and in South Vietnam, it was ground hand-to-hand combat. You can see the escalation here of numbers. We go from 16,000 military advisors, which means no one embattled as an actual soldier, to 6 years later having over 500,000 troops. And with these troops did not come victory. Okay, we were continually fighting with one hand behind our back. The reason for that is people knew that we had to fight in Vietnam so as to prevent South Vietnam from falling to communists, but not to fight so badly that China or the USSR would declare war on the United States. And we fought a limited war for limited objectives, which eventually will hurt us. There was extensive opposition in America for Vietnam. People grew very weary of all the death and murder, especially because we realized that we weren't getting anything from it. So Nixon decides that he is going to pursue a strategy known as peace with honor, and he does so by pushing for peace in phases. He had negotiations. He reduced the number of combat troops. He did order massive bombing strikes, and then on the heels of that, agreed to peace talks, hoping to sort of coerce the North Vietnamese to give in. In 1973, the final U.S. troops pull out of Vietnam, and within months, fighting resumed. The North invades the South 2 years later, and the South Vietnamese ask for American help, and we refuse because it's made clear that we cannot win in Vietnam without going farther than the American public is prepared to do. The CIA, as a spy agency, worked across the globe. As I said, worked the Bay of Pigs. As another Marxist friend of Cuba's President Castro is running in Chile, Nixon authorizes $10 million to prevent him from winning. The CIA attempted to solidify a military coup and basically overthrows a government because they are hoping to pursue anti-communist ideals in Chile. In consolidating control over Chile, Pinochet executed thousands of people. It was another example of the United States being so obsessed by anti-communism and protecting American interests, it was willing to interfere in the democratic process of other nations. We were willing to remove an elected leader because we did not agree with his political affiliations. So as we are attempting to thaw this Cold War, Nixon is going to pursue détente across the board. He pursued peace with honor in Vietnam. Détente is he wants to chill out the relationship with the Soviets and with the Chinese. So he took a trip to Beijing to recognize communist China. It's a very controversial decision. It infuriated many Americans. But he knew that if he could get China on his side, it would help him neutralize the growing power of the Soviet Union. In the Soviet Union, he worked with Brezhnev to secure the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. He hoped to limit the number of nuclear warheads each side possessed as a way to try to diffuse threats of global war. In general, from the 1970s, presidents pursued détente with Russia, an easing of tensions. The unification of Germany facilitates this further easing and will ultimately help to spur on the end of the Soviet Union. When West German Chancellor makes a deal with East Germany for these to unify, this accelerates the end of the Cold War. Gorbachev in 1985 is head of the USSR. He hopes to reform communism in order to save it. He institutes economic restructuring and openness in government. As he begins to loosen his reins on the power that the Soviet Union had, you have a series of velvet revolutions across the East Bloc where various Soviet countries begin to vote communists out of office. Boris Yeltsin is one leader who was elected in Russia. He wants to have Russia be apart from the Soviet Union. He wanted Russia to have democratic reforms, so he pursues that. Gorbachev is eventually ousted from power, and on December 25th, 1991, the USSR dissolved itself. For the first time in 4 decades, Soviet and American nuclear weapons were not standing ready for mutual destruction.